I want you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine being left utterly powerless, trapped in a tiny, silent box where every second stretches like a lifetime. And then, in the darkness, someone you barely know leans close to whisper something so raw, so human, it shakes everything you thought you understood about your life. I don't know where you're watching from. Maybe you've ever felt invisible at work, overlooked by the very people counting on you. Maybe you're the new face in a place that feels cold and unwelcoming. Or perhaps you, like so many of us, wear hope like armor while your heart aches quietly underneath. Wherever you are, this story from the heart of New York City, about a millionaire stuck in an elevator with a young waitress, promises to touch something inside you. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of Lydia's table, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor that had seen countless footsteps, spilled coffee, and whispered conversations. Clara Martinez wiped down the same table for the third time, her movements automatic after 6 years of serving breakfast to the hurried masses of Manhattan's Lower East Side. At 23, her hands already bore the calluses of hard work, small scars from hot plates, permanent coffee stains under her fingernails, and the slight tremor that came from carrying heavy trays for 12-hour shifts. The bistro smelled of garlic, fresh basil, and the lingering aroma of last night's marinara sauce that clung to the red-checkered tablecloths. Clara inhaled deeply, finding comfort in these familiar scents that had become the soundtrack of her survival. She had arrived in New York 3 years ago, with nothing but a battered suitcase and a heart full of dreams that seemed to shrink a little more each day. The city had promised her everything: Broadway stages, art galleries, perhaps even love, but instead, it had given her aching feet, missed rent payments, and the hollow echo of her own voice asking, "More coffee?" Every morning at 5:30, Clara would emerge from the cramped studio apartment she shared with 2 other girls in Queens, her breath visible in the cold air as she walked to the subway station. The train ride into Manhattan was her daily meditation, watching the city wake up through smudged windows while she practiced her smile in the reflection. She had learned that customers preferred their waitresses cheerful, accommodating, and most importantly, invisible once the food arrived. Her manager, Tony, was a gruff man in his 50s who treated his staff like replaceable parts in a machine. He called Clara "Sweetheart," with the tone of someone who had forgotten her actual name years ago. "Sweetheart, table 6 needs more bread. Sweetheart, the coffee's getting cold. Sweetheart, smile more. You look like someone died." Clara would nod, tuck a strand of her dark hair behind her ear, and comply without protest. She needed this job too desperately to risk losing it over pride. The customers were a mixture of neighborhood regulars and tourists who wandered in from nearby Little Italy. Clara had served them all: the construction workers who left generous tips and kind words, the businesswomen who barely looked up from their phones, the elderly couples who reminded her of the grandparents she had left behind in New Mexico. She memorized their orders, anticipated their needs, and absorbed their frustrations when the kitchen was slow or the coffee was bitter. She was their confessor, their servant, and their scapegoat, all for $8 an hour plus tips that barely covered her subway fare. But Clara harbored secrets behind her practiced smile. She spent her evenings at the public library devouring books on business management and economics, dreaming of someday opening her own restaurant where the staff would be treated with dignity. She had enrolled in night classes at a community college, paying tuition with the money she saved from eating ramen noodles for weeks. Her notebooks were filled with sketches of restaurant layouts, menu ideas, and careful calculations of startup costs that seemed as distant as the stars. Late at night, when the city finally quieted and her roommates were asleep, Clara would sit by the window and write letters to her younger brother Miguel back home. She never sent them. He had died 2 years ago in a car accident, leaving her completely alone in the world. But writing to him helped her process the loneliness, the exhaustion, and the growing fear that she was disappearing into the anonymous crowd of service workers who kept the city running while remaining perpetually unseen. On this particular Tuesday morning, Lydia's table was buzzing with the usual breakfast rush when Clara noticed him for the first time. Thomas Grayson sat at table 12 by the window, his perfectly tailored charcoal suit and platinum watch catching the morning light. He was younger than she had expected from the articles she had read about him in discarded newspapers, perhaps 45, with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes that seemed to look through everything rather than at it. His fingers moved constantly across his phone screen, conducting business deals worth more money than Clara could comprehend. Thomas Grayson was Manhattan royalty in every sense that mattered. His investment firm, Grayson Enterprises, had assets exceeding $2 billion, with diversified holdings in real estate, technology stocks, and even cryptocurrency investments that had made headlines when Bitcoin reached its peak. His penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park, filled with artwork worth more than most people's annual salaries. Yet as Clara approached his table with the coffee pot, she noticed something that his net worth statements could never capture: a profound sadness etched in the lines around his eyes. "More coffee, sir?" Clara asked softly, already tilting the pot toward his cup. Thomas glanced up briefly, nodded, and returned to his phone conversation about quarterly earnings and dividend distributions. To him, she was simply part of the restaurant's atmosphere, as essential and invisible as the background music or the morning light streaming through the windows. Clara poured his coffee with steady hands, noticing that he took it black and never touched the complimentary pastries Tony insisted they offered to obviously wealthy customers. This routine continued for weeks. Thomas would arrive at exactly 7:15, order the same breakfast, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and black coffee, and conduct business calls while Clara refilled his cup without being asked. She learned to read his moods through the tension in his shoulders, the speed of his typing, and the way his jaw tightened when certain names came up in his conversations. He never looked at her directly, never said please or thank you, and never left more than the standard 15% tip calculated to the exact penny. But Clara listened. In the spaces between his phone calls, she heard fragments of his life, worried conversations about his teenage son who was struggling in boarding school, heated discussions about a daughter who blamed him for her mother's death, and late-night calls to what sounded like grief counselors or therapists. She began to understand that Thomas Grayson, despite his billions in assets and his penthouse fortress, was drowning in a loneliness that money could not cure. One morning, Clara overheard him canceling yet another family dinner because of a critical merger that required his attention. She watched him end the call and stare out the window for a long moment, his usually sharp business demeanor cracking just enough to reveal the broken man underneath. Without thinking, she approached his table and quietly refilled his coffee cup, allowing her hand to briefly rest on the table near his. "I hope your day gets better, Mr. Grayson," she said gently, using his name for the first time. Thomas looked up, startled. Perhaps because it had been months since someone had spoken to him as a human being rather than a business opportunity. For just a moment, their eyes met across the vast divide of their different worlds, and Clara saw something flicker there, recognition, maybe even gratitude. But the moment passed quickly as his phone rang again, pulling him back into the relentless machinery of high finance. Clara returned to her duties, unaware that this small act of kindness had planted a seed in Thomas's consciousness. She continued serving her other tables, the arguing couple at table 4, the lonely professor who came in every day to grade papers, the group of nurses ending their night shift at the nearby hospital. Each customer received the same careful attention, the same gentle smile, and the same invisible grace that had become Clara's signature in a world that rarely noticed the people who served it. The morning rush eventually slowed, and Clara began her ritual of wiping down tables and refilling salt shakers. Tony emerged from the kitchen, sweat beading on his forehead, and surveyed the dining room with the critical eye of someone perpetually dissatisfied with everything around him. "Table 12 left his newspaper," Tony growled, gesturing toward Thomas's vacated spot. "Clean it up, sweetheart, and make sure you wash that table good. Rich people don't like sitting where other people's germs might be." Clara nodded and approached the table, gathering the financial section that Thomas had left behind. As she folded the newspaper, she caught sight of a headline about Grayson Enterprises' latest acquisition, a chain of affordable housing developments that would be converted to luxury condominiums. The irony was not lost on her. The same man who sat in her section every morning, surrounded by the warmth of working-class conversation and the aroma of simple food, was systematically removing affordable housing from neighborhoods like the one where Clara struggled to pay rent. She wondered if he ever considered the human cost of his business decisions, if the people displaced by his developments ever crossed his mind during his solitary breakfast ritual. But Clara kept these observations to herself, folding the newspaper neatly and placing it by the register in case Thomas returned for it. She had learned long ago that waitresses were not supposed to have opinions about their customers' lives or business practices. They were supposed to pour coffee, deliver food, and remain as invisible as the furniture that surrounded them. As the lunch rush began, Clara tied her apron tighter and prepared for another shift of careful invisibility, unaware that fate was already setting the stage for an encounter that would shatter both her anonymity and Thomas Grayson's carefully constructed emotional fortress. The elevator in the building where he conducted his most important business meetings was about to become the unlikely crucible where two vastly different worlds would collide, creating sparks that neither of them could have possibly anticipated. The autumn rain fell in steady sheets across Manhattan that Friday evening, turning the streets into rivers of reflected neon and honking car horns. Clara pulled her thin coat tighter as she hurried down Fifth Avenue, her shift at Lydia's table finally over after a particularly grueling 14-hour day. She had been called in early to cover for Maria, who was home with a sick child, and stayed late to help with a private party that had ordered enough food to feed a small army. Her feet ached in her worn sneakers, and her lower back throbbed from carrying heavy trays all day. But the overtime pay meant she could finally afford her textbooks for next semester's accounting class. She was thinking about the homework waiting for her at home when she noticed the commotion outside the gleaming glass tower at 432 Park Avenue. A small crowd had gathered, and security guards were directing people away from the main entrance. Clara slowed her pace, curious despite her exhaustion. This was one of Manhattan's most exclusive buildings, home to penthouse apartments that cost more than she would earn in several lifetimes. She had read about it in the real estate sections of newspapers left behind by customers. One-bedroom condos starting at $4 million, amenities that included a private restaurant and a spa more luxurious than anything she had ever imagined. "Elevator's stuck," she heard one of the security guards explaining to a well-dressed woman who was clearly agitated about missing her dinner reservation. "We've got emergency services on the way, but it might take a while. Building's only got 2 working elevators right now. The third one's been down for maintenance all week." Clara was about to continue walking when she heard a familiar voice cutting through the general murmur of conversation. Through the glass doors of the lobby, she could see Thomas Grayson pacing back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear, his usual composure cracked with obvious irritation. Even from a distance, she could read the tension in his shoulders and the sharp gestures that accompanied his conversation. "I don't care if it takes all night," Thomas was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the lobby's marble acoustics. "I have a conference call with Tokyo in 2 hours, and I need to be in my office. This is completely unacceptable." He ended the call abruptly and turned to the head of security, a patient-looking man in his 60s who was clearly accustomed to dealing with demanding residents. "Mr. Grayson, I understand your frustration," the security chief was saying, "but the elevator stopped between floors 42 and 43 about 20 minutes ago. The fire department is on their way, and we should have you out shortly." "Shortly isn't good enough," Thomas snapped, running his hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Do you have any idea what this delay is costing me? I've got investors from 3 different time zones waiting for my call, and a merger that depends on decisions made in the next few hours. This building charges residents enough money to ensure that these kinds of mechanical failures don't happen." Clara watched this scene unfold with a mixture of sympathy and irritation. She recognized Thomas's panic, the same desperate energy she felt when she was running late for work and knew that Tony would dock her pay for every minute past her scheduled start time. But she also bristled at his assumption that his time was more valuable than anyone else's, that his wealth entitled him to solutions that defied the basic laws of mechanical repair. Without fully understanding why, Clara pushed through the glass doors and approached the security desk. The lobby was a monument to wealth and taste, marble floors that reflected the crystal chandeliers, abstract sculptures that probably cost more than her annual salary, and the faint scent of expensive cologne and fresh flowers. Her sneakers squeaked slightly on the polished stone, and she was acutely aware of how out of place she must look in her coffee-stained uniform and discount store coat. "Excuse me," she said quietly to the security chief. "I couldn't help but overhear. Someone's trapped in the elevator?" The man looked at her with polite but guarded interest, clearly wondering what business she might have in a building where the cheapest apartment cost more than most people's houses. "Yes, miss. We have the situation under control. But thank you for your concern." His tone was diplomatic but dismissive, the same way people spoke to Clara when she tried to report a mechanical problem with the coffee machine at work. Polite acknowledgement followed by the clear expectation that she should mind her own business. But Thomas had overheard the exchange and turned toward them, his frustrated gaze landing on Clara with a flicker of recognition. For just a moment, his shoulders relaxed slightly as he processed the familiar face, even though he couldn't quite place where he knew her from. Clara felt her cheeks flush under his scrutiny, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance after a long day of work. "Do I know you?" Thomas asked, his business instincts automatically cataloging potential connections even in the midst of his crisis. Clara nodded slightly, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her worn purse. "I'm Clara. I serve your coffee at Lydia's Table, the Italian place on Mulberry Street. You come in most mornings." She paused, then added softly, "You always order 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and black coffee." Thomas blinked, and for the first time in months, his relentless mental calculator paused its constant tallying of profits and losses. Here was someone who had been part of his daily routine for weeks, someone who knew his breakfast order better than his own assistant knew his schedule, and yet he had never really seen her. The realization was oddly unsettling, like discovering that a piece of furniture in his penthouse had actually been a person all along. "Right," he said slowly, his voice losing some of its sharp edge. "Clara, what are you doing here?" It was a reasonable question, given that they were standing in the lobby of one of Manhattan's most expensive residential buildings, and Thomas was beginning to remember that his morning coffee came with a side of working-class authenticity that seemed completely at odds with this marble and crystal environment. "I was walking home from work and saw the crowd," Clara explained, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear in a gesture that was becoming automatic whenever she felt nervous or out of place. "I thought maybe I could help somehow. I used to work maintenance at an apartment complex in college. Nothing fancy like this, but elevators are elevators. Sometimes they just need someone to try the emergency protocols from the outside." The security chief looked skeptical, but Thomas found himself oddly intrigued by this unexpected offer of assistance. Perhaps it was his desperate need to resolve the situation, or maybe it was simple curiosity about this woman who had been serving his coffee for months while remaining essentially invisible to him. Either way, he nodded toward the security chief with the authority of someone accustomed to having his decisions respected without question. "Let her try," Thomas said firmly. "If the fire department isn't here yet, what do we have to lose?" The security chief hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing the liability issues against the wishes of one of the building's most influential residents. Finally, he nodded and gestured for Clara to follow him toward the service elevators. "The stuck car is number 3, he explained as they walked through a corridor lined with abstract paintings that probably cost more than Clara's college tuition. "It stopped between floors 42 and 43 about 30 minutes ago. We can hear the passenger moving around inside, so we know he's okay. But the car won't respond to any of our standard reset procedures." Clara nodded, her mind automatically shifting into problem-solving mode, despite the surreal circumstances of offering elevator repair services in a building where she could never afford to live. As they approached the service area, she could hear muffled shouting coming from the elevator shaft. Someone was clearly growing increasingly frustrated with their confinement. "Has anyone tried a manual override from the machine room?" Clara asked, examining the control panel with the systematic attention of someone who had actually worked with her hands rather than simply managed other people's labor. The security chief looked surprised by her technical knowledge. "We tried the main reset, but the machine room override requires 2 people, one to monitor the car position and one to operate the manual controls. We're short-staffed tonight because of some scheduling conflicts." He paused, then looked at Clara with newfound respect. "You really know about elevator maintenance?" "Enough to be dangerous," Clara replied with a slight smile, the first genuine expression she had worn since entering this temple of wealth and privilege. "If you can monitor the car position, I can work the manual controls. Worst case scenario, we don't make things any worse than they already are." Thomas had followed them into the service corridor, his usual command of every situation somewhat shaken by the novelty of relying on someone whose existence he had barely acknowledged before this evening. He watched Clara examine the elevator machinery with the focused attention of someone who actually understood how things worked, rather than simply expecting them to work because money had been paid. "This is highly irregular," the security chief muttered, but he was already opening the machine room door and gesturing for Clara to follow him. "Mr. Grayson, you might want to wait in the lobby while we attempt this. If something goes wrong—" "I'm staying," Thomas said firmly, surprised by his own decision. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was the growing realization that he was about to owe a significant debt to someone he had never bothered to truly see. Either way, he found himself following Clara into the mechanical heart of the building, surrounded by the steady hum of motors and cables that kept dozens of wealthy residents moving smoothly between their elevated worlds. Clara approached the manual override controls with careful confidence, her calloused hands moving over the switches and levers with practiced competence. For the first time since entering this building, she felt like she belonged somewhere, not because of her bank account or her postal code, but because she possessed knowledge and skills that were actually needed. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "On my count, we're going to try a slow manual descent to the 42nd floor. If the car starts to drop too quickly, hit the emergency brake immediately." She paused, looking directly at Thomas for the first time since they had entered the machine room. "This might get a little scary, but trust me, I won't let anyone get hurt." Thomas found himself nodding, struck by the quiet confidence in Clara's voice and the steady competence of her movements. For someone whose daily life revolved around managing other people's expertise, there was something deeply reassuring about watching someone who actually knew how to fix things rather than simply knowing how to hire people to fix things. As Clara began the careful process of manually lowering the stuck elevator car, Thomas realized that he was about to discover whether the woman who had been serving his coffee for months possessed the same invisible competence in crisis situations that she demonstrated every morning with his breakfast order. The next few minutes would reveal whether his inadvertent reliance on her quiet efficiency extended beyond remembering that he preferred wheat toast to white. The elevator car descended slowly, its movement accompanied by the grinding protests of machinery that had been strained beyond its normal parameters. Clara's hands remained steady on the controls, her attention focused entirely on the delicate balance between progress and safety. And for the first time in weeks, Thomas Grayson found himself completely focused on something other than his own problems, watching this unlikely rescuer prove that competence and courage were not necessarily correlated with net worth or social position. The grinding sound of the elevator machinery filled the small control room as Clara carefully adjusted the manual override controls. Her movements deliberate and precise despite the unfamiliar luxury surrounding her. Thomas watched in fascination as this woman who had spent months being invisible in his daily routine demonstrated a competence that his billions of dollars in assets could not purchase. The security chief monitored the car's position through a small window that showed the elevator shaft, calling out floor numbers as the stuck car slowly descended. 43. Looking good? 42 and a half? His voice was tense but hopeful as Clara maintained steady pressure on the manual controls, guiding the car toward the 42nd floor with the patience of someone who understood that some problems could not be solved by throwing money at them or demanding immediate results. Almost there, Clara murmured, her concentration absolute as she made minute adjustments to compensate for the car's tendency to drop too quickly. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the building's perfectly controlled climate, and Thomas found himself holding his breath as the car approached the landing. 42, coming up on the doors now. There was a soft thud as the elevator car settled into perfect alignment with the 42nd floor, followed by the mechanical click of the doors automatically unlocking. Through the shaft, they could hear the obvious relief of the trapped passenger as the elevator doors slid open and he stepped onto solid ground for the first time in nearly an hour. "Outstanding work," the security chief said, genuine admiration replacing his earlier skepticism about allowing a waitress to operate building machinery. "That was as smooth as anything our regular maintenance crew could have managed." He turned to Thomas, who was still processing the strange experience of watching someone solve a problem through manual labor rather than executive decision-making. Clara stepped back from the control panel, wiping her hands on her coat as the adrenaline of the successful rescue gave way to the sudden self-consciousness of being surrounded by wealth far beyond her comprehension. The machine room, which had felt comfortable and familiar while she was working, now seemed to emphasize exactly how out of place she was in this environment of marble lobbies and million-dollar condominiums. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of gratitude that surprised even him. "That was impressive. I had no idea you knew about elevator repair." His tone held the genuine curiosity of someone encountering unexpected depths in a person he had categorized as simple and one-dimensional. "I worked maintenance through college to pay tuition," Clara replied, her modesty automatic after years of downplaying her capabilities to avoid making customers uncomfortable with her intelligence. "You learn to fix whatever breaks when you can't afford to call a service technician every time something goes wrong." The three of them made their way back toward the lobby, where a small crowd had gathered around the rescued passenger, a middle-aged businessman who was effusively thanking everyone within earshot for his liberation from the confined space. Thomas noticed how Clara quietly slipped toward the exit, clearly intending to continue her walk home without seeking recognition for her role in the rescue. "Wait," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the marble expanse of the lobby. Clara turned back, her expression politely attentive but guarded, as if she expected to be dismissed now that her usefulness had ended. "I'd like to buy you dinner, as a thank you for your help tonight." Clara's surprise was obvious, her hand instinctively moving to smooth down her work uniform as she processed this unexpected invitation from someone whose daily coffee routine had never extended to actual conversation. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Grayson. But you don't need to thank me. I was happy to help." "I insist," Thomas said, and for the first time in months the words came from genuine human impulse rather than calculated business strategy. "There's an excellent restaurant on the top floor of this building. The view alone is worth the trip, and after what you just did, dinner is the least I can offer." The security chief was watching this exchange with barely concealed amazement, clearly witnessing a side of Thomas Grayson that the building's wealthy residents rarely saw. Here was a man whose typical interaction with service personnel consisted of efficient transactions designed to minimize personal contact, suddenly inviting his morning waitress to dine at one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. Clara hesitated, acutely aware of her coffee-stained uniform and the vast social distance between herself and someone who could casually suggest dinner at a restaurant where the wine probably cost more than her monthly rent. "I'm not really dressed for a fancy restaurant," she said finally, gesturing to her practical work clothes with embarrassed honesty. "You're dressed like someone who just spent her evening helping a stranger in crisis," Thomas replied, his voice softer than Clara had ever heard it during their morning coffee exchanges. "Trust me, that's exactly the right outfit for dinner with me tonight." 20 minutes later, Clara found herself seated across from Thomas Grayson at a table overlooking the glittering expanse of Manhattan, surrounded by crystal glasses and silver cutlery that reflected the city lights like scattered diamonds. The restaurant was nearly empty. It was past the usual dinner hour, and most of the building's residents were either traveling or attending social events that filled their calendars with the endless obligations of maintaining their elevated positions. The view was breathtaking, stretching from the Hudson River to the East River, with Central Park spread below them like a dark green carpet dotted with the warm glow of streetlights. Clara had lived in New York for 3 years without ever seeing the city from this perspective, and she found herself wondering how different life must look when you could literally rise above the street-level struggles that defined most people's daily existence. "I've never been this high up in Manhattan," Clara admitted, her voice filled with genuine wonder as she took in the panoramic view. "It's beautiful, but it's also kind of overwhelming. Everything looks so small from up here." Thomas followed her gaze out toward the city, seeing it through her eyes instead of the calculations of property values and investment opportunities that usually occupied his thoughts when he looked out his penthouse windows. "I suppose it does," he said slowly. "I don't think I've noticed the view in years. It just becomes background after a while." The waiter approached with menus bound in leather that probably cost more than Clara's hourly wage, and she found herself staring at dishes with descriptions she couldn't entirely decode and prices that made her mentally calculate how many hours of work each entree represented. Thomas noticed her discomfort and gently suggested that she let him order for both of them. "The conversation is what matters," he said, closing his menu decisively. "Food is just fuel." It was a casual comment that revealed the profound difference between someone who had never worried about affording meals and someone who still sometimes chose between groceries and textbooks when money was tight. As their meal progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Removed from the familiar context of their morning coffee ritual, Thomas and Clara discovered that they were capable of actual conversation. Clara found herself talking about her night classes in business administration, her dreams of someday opening a restaurant where the staff would be treated with dignity and respect. Thomas, meanwhile, shared his struggle to connect with his teenage children, who blamed him for their mother's death and his subsequent emotional withdrawal. "They're not wrong," Thomas admitted, swirling the wine in his glass as he spoke. "After Sarah died, I threw myself into work because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. Numbers don't lie, contracts don't break your heart, and investment portfolios don't leave you feeling helpless in hospital rooms at 3 a.m. Clara listened with the careful attention she had perfected during countless shifts of letting customers confess their troubles over coffee and pastry. But this was different. She was no longer the invisible audience for someone else's problems, but an actual participant in a conversation between equals, despite the obvious disparity in their bank accounts. "Grief makes us do strange things," Clara said softly, thinking of her own response to Miguel's death, the unanswered letters, the loneliness she carried like a weight in her chest, the way she had thrown herself into work and classes to avoid sitting still long enough to feel the full impact of her loss. Sometimes survival looks like abandonment from the outside. Thomas looked at her with surprise, recognizing a depth of understanding that he had not expected from someone whose life seemed defined by the simple mechanics of serving food and taking orders. "You sound like you know something about that," he said, his voice gentle with curiosity rather than the probing intensity he usually brought to business conversations. Clara hesitated, unused to being asked about her own experiences rather than simply providing comfort for other people's problems. "My brother died 2 years ago," she said finally. "Car accident back home in New Mexico. I came to New York partly to escape dealing with it, but mostly because I didn't know how to stay in a place where everything reminded me of him. The confession hung in the air between them, creating an unexpected intimacy in the gleaming restaurant high above the city. Thomas felt something shift in his perception of this woman who had been part of his daily routine for months without ever registering as a complete human being with her own sorrows and dreams and complicated history. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words carried genuine sympathy rather than the polite condolences he offered during business meetings when personal tragedy intruded on professional relationships. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "It was," Clara acknowledged, surprised by how good it felt to speak Miguel's name aloud to someone who was actually listening. "But it also taught me something about the difference between being alone and being lonely. You can be surrounded by people all day and still feel completely isolated if none of them actually see you as a person rather than a function." Thomas winced slightly at the accuracy of her observation, recognizing his own experience in her words. His penthouse was filled with staff, his office was constantly bustling with employees and clients, and his social calendar was packed with events that required his presence. Yet he could go days without having a genuine conversation with another human being, surrounded by people who saw him as a source of income or opportunity rather than a person struggling with loss and regret. As the evening progressed, they discovered unexpected common ground in their shared understanding of isolation disguised as busy social lives. Clara's invisible service work and Thomas's elevated executive position had created identical experiences of human disconnection, despite the vast difference in their material circumstances. They were both experts at performing their roles while keeping their authentic selves hidden from view. When Thomas finally called for the check, a number that represented more money than Clara typically saw in a month, she felt the evening's spell beginning to break. The fantasy of sitting across from someone who saw her as an equal rather than a service provider was giving way to the reality of their fundamentally different worlds. Tomorrow morning, she would be back behind the counter at Lydia's table, and he would return to his breakfast routine of conducting business calls while she refilled his coffee cup in comfortable anonymity. "Thank you for dinner," Clara said as they prepared to leave the restaurant, "and for the conversation. I can't remember the last time someone asked me what I thought about something rather than what I could get them." Thomas felt an unexpected pang of loss as he realized that their brief excursion into genuine human connection was coming to an end. "Thank you for fixing the elevator," he replied, "and for reminding me that competence comes in forms I hadn't considered." They rode down in the same elevator that Clara had rescued earlier that evening, the space filled with a comfortable silence that acknowledged both the significance of their conversation and the likelihood that tomorrow would restore their familiar pattern of polite but distant interaction. Thomas walked her to the lobby entrance, where the doorman held open the gleaming glass door that separated the building's rarefied atmosphere from the ordinary chaos of New York street life. "I'll see you Monday morning," Clara said, pulling her coat tighter against the night air as she prepared to walk to the subway station. "Same table, same order?" "Same table, same order," Thomas confirmed, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if he was no longer sure that their morning routine could return to its previous simplicity. He watched her disappear into the crowd of late-night pedestrians, her figure quickly lost among the anonymous masses of people who kept the city functioning while remaining largely invisible to those who benefited from their labor. As Thomas rode the elevator up to his penthouse, he found himself thinking about Clara's observation regarding the difference between being alone and being lonely. For the first time in years, he had spent an evening in the company of someone who had listened to him without calculation, who had offered help without expectation of reward, and who had shared her own vulnerability without seeking advantage. The experience was both deeply satisfying and profoundly unsettling, suggesting possibilities for human connection that his carefully structured life had systematically eliminated. Monday morning arrived with the same relentless punctuality that had governed Thomas's routine for years, but as he sat at table 12 in Lydia's table, something had fundamentally shifted. When Clara approached with the coffee pot and her familiar smile, he looked directly at her for the first time in months, seeing not just the efficient waitress, but the complete person who had rescued a stranger and shared dinner conversation that had touched parts of his heart he had thought permanently closed. The morning light filtering through the bistro's windows caught the highlights in Clara's dark hair as she poured his coffee, and Thomas found himself noticing details that had been invisible during months of routine interaction. Her hands moved with practiced grace, but he could see the small scars from kitchen work and the slight tremor of exhaustion from standing on her feet for long hours. Her smile was genuine, but carefully maintained, the expression of someone who had learned to project warmth even when her own reserves were running low. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," Clara said, her voice carrying the same professional courtesy as always, but now Thomas could hear the intelligence and thoughtfulness that lay beneath her service industry politeness. "2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and black coffee?" "Please," Thomas replied, but instead of immediately turning to his phone, he continued looking at her with obvious attention. "And Clara, thank you again for Friday night. Both for the elevator repair and for the conversation." Clara felt her cheeks warm with a mixture of pleasure and embarrassment. In the bright morning light of the bistro, surrounded by the familiar sounds of clattering dishes and morning conversation, their dinner at the exclusive restaurant felt almost dreamlike, too removed from her daily reality to have actually happened. "It was my pleasure," she said softly. "I enjoyed it too." For a moment they regarded each other across the invisible boundary that separated customer from server, both aware that something had changed but uncertain about how to navigate this shift in their relationship. Thomas wanted to extend their conversation, to ask about her weekend or her classes, or whether she had given any more thought to their discussion about opening her own restaurant. But the morning rush was beginning, and Clara's attention was already being pulled toward other tables where customers were signaling for coffee refills and menu explanations. "I should let you get back to work," Thomas said, recognizing the practical constraints that governed Clara's morning, even if his own schedule was flexible enough to accommodate extended conversation. "But perhaps, would you be interested in having coffee sometime? Away from here, I mean. Somewhere we could actually talk without interruption." The invitation hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both found simultaneously appealing and concerning. Clara was flattered by Thomas's apparent interest in continuing their acquaintance, but she was also acutely aware of the potential complications that could arise from blurring the boundaries between her professional and personal life. Thomas, meanwhile, was surprised by his own impulse to pursue a relationship that had no clear business advantage and considerable potential for disrupting his carefully organized existence. Before Clara could formulate a response, Tony emerged from the kitchen with his usual morning scowl and began surveying the dining room for evidence of inefficiency or customer dissatisfaction. His gaze landed on Clara standing beside Thomas's table, engaged in what appeared to be personal conversation rather than efficient service, and his expression darkened with disapproval. "Clara!" Tony called out sharply, his voice carrying across the restaurant with the authority of someone accustomed to having his displeasure immediately acknowledged. "Table 6 is still waiting for their coffee, and we've got customers backing up at the door. This isn't social hour." Clara's face flushed with embarrassment as she realized that her colleagues and customers were now witness to her public reprimand. She had been serving breakfast efficiently for 6 years without a single complaint about her work ethic, but Tony's criticism carried the sting of humiliation that came from being reduced to her worst moments in front of people whose respect she valued. "Of course, I'm sorry," Clara said quickly, her professional composure intact despite the mortification of being scolded like a child. She turned back to Thomas with an apologetic smile. "I need to take care of my other tables. Enjoy your breakfast." Thomas watched her walk away, noting the straightening of her shoulders and the careful control of her expression as she shifted back into full service mode. He felt an unexpected surge of anger at Tony's public reprimand, recognizing the casual cruelty of humiliating an employee who had been engaged in polite conversation for less than 2 minutes. The interaction revealed the precarious nature of Clara's position, how quickly professional courtesy could be reframed as insubordination when viewed through the lens of class distinction and economic power. As Clara moved efficiently through her morning routine, refilling coffee cups and delivering orders with her usual grace, Thomas found himself watching the careful choreography of service work with new appreciation. He saw how she anticipated customers' needs, diffused potential complaints with gentle humor, and maintained her dignified composure even when dealing with demanding or dismissive clients. Her competence was remarkable, but it was the kind of skill that remained invisible as long as it functioned smoothly. Tony's criticism had also served as a sharp reminder of the fundamental inequality that defined their relationship. Thomas could afford to spend 10 minutes in conversation because his time belonged to him. Clara could not afford the same luxury because her time belonged to her employer, her customers, and the relentless economic pressure that governed every moment of her working life. The dinner they had shared represented hours of her labor, yet she could not spare 2 minutes for personal conversation during business hours without facing professional consequences. When Clara returned to refill his coffee, her movements efficient and impersonal now, designed to minimize any appearance of impropriety, Thomas felt compelled to address the uncomfortable scene that had just unfolded. "I'm sorry about that," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to get you in trouble with your boss." "It's fine," Clara replied, but her tone was distant now, the warmth from Friday evening and early this morning carefully suppressed in favor of professional neutrality. "Tony's just doing his job, and so am I." The words were a gentle but clear establishment of boundaries, a reminder that their evening of genuine connection existed in a separate sphere from the daily reality of her work life. Thomas understood the message. Whatever personal relationship they might develop would have to exist entirely outside the bistro, where the economics of service created inevitable power imbalances that made equality impossible. As Thomas finished his breakfast and prepared to leave for his office, he realized that their brief venture into human connection had actually complicated their professional relationship rather than enhancing it. Claire's job required her to be friendly and accommodating to customers, but not genuinely personal. His interest in her as a person, however well-intentioned, had created tension in her workplace and drawn unwanted attention to interactions that needed to remain seamlessly invisible. Walking toward his office through the crowded streets of Manhattan, Thomas found himself thinking about the casual brutality of Tony's public reprimand and the resigned grace with which Clara had absorbed it. He recognized the scene as a microcosm of broader social dynamics that he had never been forced to consider. The way service workers navigated constant judgment about their personal worth, the precarious balance between human dignity and economic necessity, and the exhausting emotional labor of maintaining professional courtesy in the face of condescension or dismissal. For Clara, the morning had served as a sharp reminder of the invisible boundaries that governed her daily life. The evening she had spent with Thomas had been a brief excursion into a world where her thoughts and experiences mattered for their own sake rather than their utility to others. But Monday morning had restored the familiar dynamic where her primary value lay in anticipating needs, absorbing frustration, and remaining sufficiently invisible that customers could conduct their lives without being reminded that she was a complete person with her own concerns and aspirations. She spent the rest of her shift processing the complex emotions that Thomas's dinner invitation had stirred up. Part of her was genuinely tempted by the possibility of continuing their conversation in a context where she could be herself rather than performing the role of accommodating server. But another part of her was wary of the potential complications that could arise from pursuing a personal relationship with someone whose economic power made genuine equality impossible. As the lunch rush began and Clara tied her apron tighter for another few hours of careful service, she made a mental note to decline Thomas's invitation politely but firmly the next time he brought it up. Some boundaries existed for good reasons, and the distance between their worlds was measured in more than just dollars. It was defined by fundamentally different relationships to power, security, and the basic human dignity that everyone deserved, but not everyone could afford to claim. The afternoon wore on with its familiar rhythm of clearing tables, taking orders, and managing the constant low-level stress that came from juggling multiple demanding customers while maintaining the appearance of effortless competence. Clara moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, but part of her attention remained focused on the morning's encounter and the larger questions it had raised about the invisible barriers that shaped interactions across class lines. When her shift finally ended, and she hung up her apron for the day, Clara felt the usual mixture of exhaustion and relief that accompanied the transition from work mode to personal time. But today, those familiar emotions were complicated by the lingering memory of Friday night's dinner conversation and the morning's reminder of the careful boundaries that governed her interactions with customers who possessed the economic power to disrupt her carefully balanced existence. As she walked to the subway station through the early afternoon crowds, Clara found herself wondering whether Thomas would continue coming to Lydia's table for his morning coffee, or whether the complications introduced by their personal conversation would lead him to find a different restaurant for his breakfast routine. Either outcome would represent a loss. His continued presence would maintain the tension between professional service and personal interest, while his absence would eliminate one of the few customers who had ever bothered to learn her name and appreciate the quality of her work. The train ride home gave Clara time to process the day's emotional complexity and arrive at a decision about how to handle future interactions with Thomas. She would remain professional and courteous, as she was with all her customers, but she would not pursue the personal connection that had seemed so appealing during their dinner conversation. The morning's public reprimand had reminded her that her job security depended on maintaining clear boundaries between service and friendship, regardless of how much she might value genuine human connection. By the time Clara reached her small apartment in Queens, she had restored her emotional equilibrium and recommitted herself to the practical priorities that governed her daily life: work, school, and the long-term goal of building a career that would eventually free her from the precarious economics of service work. Thomas Grayson would remain what he had always been, a courteous customer who tipped well and appreciated good service, nothing more and nothing less than that. But even as Clara settled into her evening routine of homework and meal preparation, part of her couldn't quite forget the feeling of being seen as a complete person rather than simply a function, or the tantalizing possibility that human connection might be possible across even the most formidable social boundaries. The memory of Friday night's conversation lingered like the aftertaste of exceptional wine, too brief to satisfy, too significant to dismiss, and too removed from daily reality to provide practical guidance for the choices that lay ahead. The following Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzling, with the kind of October weather that made getting out of bed feel like a small act of heroism. Clara pulled her jacket hood up against the rain as she walked from the subway station to Lydia's table, her sneakers splashing through puddles that reflected the neon signs of businesses just beginning to open for the day. The early morning streets were filled with the usual crowd of commuters, construction workers, and service employees who kept the city functioning while most of its wealthy residents still slept in their climate-controlled apartments. At exactly 7:15, Thomas Grayson entered the bistro and took his customary seat at table 12, his perfectly pressed suit and expensive umbrella marking him as someone whose morning routine was insulated from the weather that soaked everyone else. Clara approached his table with her familiar smile in the coffee pot, but something in his demeanor seemed different, more distant, more formal, as if he too had spent the past day reconsidering the wisdom of blurring professional boundaries. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," Clara said, her voice carrying its usual warmth, but without the personal note that had crept into their recent interactions. "2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and black coffee?" "Yes, thank you," Thomas replied, his attention already focused on his phone screen in a deliberate return to their previous pattern of minimal interaction. The message was clear. He had decided to restore the comfortable distance that had characterized their relationship for months, treating her once again as efficient service rather than potential friend. Clara felt a complex mixture of relief and disappointment as she poured his coffee and retreated to attend to her other tables. Relief, because the tension of navigating unclear boundaries had been resolved in favor of professional simplicity. Disappointment, because the brief glimpse of genuine human connection had been more meaningful than she had wanted to admit, even to herself. For the next several weeks, Thomas and Clara maintained their restored professional relationship with careful consistency. He arrived at 7:15, ordered the same breakfast, conducted his business calls, left his standard 15% tip, and departed without personal conversation. She served his coffee, delivered his food, and provided the kind of invisible service that allowed him to conduct his morning routine without disruption or complication. But Tony had been watching their interactions with the suspicious attention of someone who distrusted any deviation from established patterns. Even though Thomas and Clara had returned to purely professional exchanges, he remembered the personal conversation that had delayed service to other tables, and he interpreted their current politeness as evidence of ongoing inappropriate familiarity that could potentially cause problems for the restaurant's reputation. On a particularly busy Friday morning in November, when the breakfast rush had stretched Lydia's table's staff to its limits and several customers were complaining about slow service, Tony's accumulated irritation finally found its target. Clara had just finished delivering Thomas's breakfast when Tony intercepted her near the kitchen, his voice loud enough to carry across the entire dining room. "Clara, I need to speak with you, now." His tone carried the ominous authority of someone preparing to deliver public criticism, and several customers looked up from their conversations to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. Clara felt her stomach clench with dread, but she followed Tony toward the front of the restaurant where their conversation would be visible to everyone present. "I've been watching you with the customer at table 12, Tony announced, his voice pitched to ensure that his words reached every corner of the bistro. "This is a restaurant, not a social club. Our customers come here for food and service, not to chat with the staff about their personal lives." Clara's face burned with humiliation as she realized that every customer, including Thomas, was now listening to her public reprimand for a crime she had not actually committed. For weeks, she had maintained scrupulous professional distance from Thomas, yet Tony was using their previous conversation as ammunition for a public shaming that served no purpose except to reinforce his authority over his workers. "I understand, Tony," Clara replied quietly, her voice steady despite the mortification of being criticized in front of the entire restaurant for behavior that belonged to the past. "I've been maintaining professional boundaries with all our customers." "Professional boundaries," Tony repeated mockingly, his tone suggesting that Clara was somehow incapable of understanding the difference between appropriate and inappropriate behavior. "Maybe professional boundaries mean something different where you come from, sweetheart. But in New York restaurants, we keep our personal problems and our romantic interests away from paying customers." The word romantic hung in the air like an accusation, transforming Clara's previous polite conversation with Thomas into something tawdry and inappropriate. Several customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward with the voyeuristic interest of people enjoying drama at someone else's expense. Clara felt her dignity crumbling under the weight of implications that bore no resemblance to the reality of her professional conduct. Thomas, meanwhile, was experiencing his own form of humiliation as he realized that his dinner invitation had somehow been transformed into evidence of Clara's professional misconduct. He could see the rigid control with which she was absorbing Tony's public criticism, and he recognized the familiar dynamic of powerful people deflecting their own failures onto subordinates who possessed no means of defending themselves. "Furthermore," Tony continued, apparently emboldened by Clara's silence, "I've had complaints from other customers about slow service, and I think it's because you're spending too much time worrying about impressing our wealthier clients instead of doing your actual job. This is a neighborhood bistro, not some fancy uptown restaurant where the waitresses can afford to play favorites. This final accusation was particularly cruel because it attacked Clara's work ethic, which had been exemplary during her 6 years of employment. Every customer received the same careful attention regardless of their apparent wealth, and her service had never been the subject of legitimate criticism. But Tony's words were designed to humiliate rather than correct, and they achieved their intended effect of making Clara question her own competence while providing public entertainment for the breakfast crowd. Clara stood in the middle of the dining room, surrounded by customers who were watching her absorb this undeserved criticism, with the fascinated attention usually reserved for car accidents or public arguments. She could feel Thomas's eyes on her, which somehow made the humiliation even more acute because he was witnessing her complete powerlessness to defend herself against accusations that bore no relationship to her actual behavior. "I apologize if my service has been inadequate," Clara said finally, her voice carrying the forced courtesy that service workers perfected when dealing with unjust criticism. "I'll make sure to focus exclusively on efficient service going forward." Tony nodded with satisfaction, having successfully demonstrated his authority over his staff while providing his customers with the morning entertainment of watching someone else's humiliation unfold in public. "See that you do," he said dismissively. "And remember, sweetheart, customers don't come here to solve your personal problems or listen to your life story. They come here for food and professional service, nothing more." As Clara returned to work, her professional composure intact but her dignity shattered, she could feel the eyes of every customer following her movements with the mixture of sympathy and voyeuristic interest that public humiliation always generates. Some seemed genuinely sorry for her, while others appeared to be enjoying the spectacle of someone being put in their place. But all of them had been turned into unwilling witnesses to her professional degradation, which somehow made the experience even more mortifying. Thomas finished his breakfast quickly, his appetite destroyed by the discomfort of watching someone be publicly humiliated for interactions that he had initiated and encouraged. As he prepared to leave, he considered saying something to Tony about the unfairness of his criticism, but he realized that any intervention on his part would only reinforce the implications that Clara was receiving special treatment because of personal rather than professional considerations. Instead, he left a tip significantly larger than usual, not enough to be obvious to other customers, but substantial enough to serve as a private acknowledgement that Clara's service had never been anything less than exemplary. It was a gesture that felt inadequate in the face of the humiliation she had just endured, but it was the only support he could offer without making her situation worse. As Thomas walked to his office through the familiar streets of Manhattan, he realized that the morning scene had illuminated the fundamental power dynamics that governed Clara's working life in ways that his previous dinner conversation had not. Her professional competence, personal dignity, and economic security were all subject to the arbitrary judgments of people who possessed authority over her simply by virtue of their position rather than their character or wisdom. The humiliation Clara had just endured was not an isolated incident, but a routine feature of service work in a society that granted some people the power to publicly shame others without consequence. Tony's criticism had been designed to entertain customers as much as discipline an employee, turning Clara's workplace into a theater where her dignity was sacrificed for the amusement of people who would forget about her suffering before they finished their coffee. For Clara, the rest of the morning passed in a haze of professional efficiency and personal mortification. She served her remaining tables with the same careful attention as always, but every interaction felt loaded with the awareness that customers were now viewing her through the lens of Tony's accusations. Some were sympathetic, offering extra generous tips or kind words that suggested they recognized the unfairness of her public criticism. Others seemed to regard her with newfound suspicion, as if Tony's words had revealed character flaws that had previously been hidden from view. When her shift finally ended, and Clara hung up her apron for the day, she felt emotionally drained in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The work itself had been routine, but the psychological toll of absorbing public humiliation while maintaining professional courtesy had left her feeling hollowed out and defeated. She gathered her belongings slowly, dreading the prospect of returning tomorrow to face the same customers who had witnessed her humiliation and the same boss who had orchestrated it. As Clara walked toward the subway station, her steps automatically carrying her toward the train that would take her back to Queens and the small apartment where she could finally let down her guard, she found herself questioning whether the job that had sustained her for 6 years was worth the cost to her dignity and self-respect. Tony's public criticism had been unfair, but it had also revealed the precarious nature of her position and the ease with which her professional reputation could be damaged by accusations that bore no relationship to her actual performance. The train ride home gave Clara time to process the morning's humiliation and consider her limited options. She could look for another restaurant job, but service work everywhere involved similar power dynamics and the constant risk of public criticism from supervisors or customers who felt entitled to express their displeasure without regard for the human cost. She could accelerate her college coursework and try to transition into a different field more quickly, but that would require additional loans and the financial risk of reducing her working hours while increasing her educational expenses. Or she could simply endure, maintaining her professional competence while building the emotional armor necessary to absorb future humiliations without letting them penetrate her sense of personal worth. It was not an appealing option, but it was perhaps the most realistic one available to someone whose economic security depended on jobs that granted other people authority over her daily dignity. By the time Clara reached her apartment, she had arrived at a provisional decision to continue working at Lydia's table while quietly exploring other employment opportunities. The morning's humiliation had been a reminder that her current situation was fundamentally precarious, subject to the arbitrary judgments of people who possessed power over her without necessarily possessing wisdom, fairness, or basic human decency. As she settled into her evening routine of homework and meal preparation, Clara tried to push aside the memory of standing in the middle of the bistro, while Tony delivered his public criticism for the entertainment of customers who would never be subjected to similar humiliation in their own workplaces. But the scene replayed itself in her mind with stubborn persistence, each repetition emphasizing her powerlessness and the casual cruelty with which her dignity had been sacrificed to reinforce existing hierarchies. The phone rang as Clara was reviewing notes for her accounting class, and she almost let it go to voicemail before recognizing the number as belonging to her friend Maria, who worked the morning shift at a different restaurant across town. Maria had heard about the morning's incident through the informal network that connected service workers across the city, and she was calling to offer support and practical advice. "Tony's an ass," Maria said bluntly after Clara had described the morning's humiliation. "Everyone knows he takes his bad moods out on whoever's convenient, and it usually falls hardest on the women. But here's the thing. You've got a reputation in this neighborhood for being one of the best waitresses around. Customers remember good service, and most of them can tell the difference between fair criticism and bullshit power trips." The conversation with Maria helped restore Clara's perspective and reminded her that Tony's public criticism reflected his own character rather than her professional competence. But it also reinforced her growing awareness that service work in New York required a constant vigilance against the petty cruelties that people inflicted on each other when economic desperation created opportunities for the exercise of arbitrary power. As Clara prepared for bed, she made a mental note to spend part of her next day off updating her resume and exploring job opportunities that might offer better protection for her dignity, even if they didn't necessarily provide better wages or working conditions. The morning's humiliation had been a wake-up call, reminding her that economic necessity was no excuse for accepting treatment that diminished her sense of personal worth. But even as she planned her eventual escape from Tony's arbitrary authority, Clara recognized that millions of other service workers faced similar daily humiliations in restaurants, hotels, retail stores, and office buildings across the city. Her individual solution would not address the broader social dynamics that made such treatment routine and acceptable, and her departure from Lydia's table would simply create an opening for another woman to absorb Tony's future frustrations and power displays. The systemic nature of the problem was both depressing and oddly comforting. Depressing because it suggested that changing jobs might only relocate rather than eliminate the fundamental power imbalances that made public humiliation a routine occupational hazard, but comforting because it confirmed that the morning's criticism reflected broader social patterns rather than Clara's personal failures or character flaws. As sleep finally overtook her exhaustion and emotional turmoil, Clara's last conscious thought was a quiet promise to herself that this morning's humiliation would not define her self-worth or determine her future choices. Tony's words had hurt because they had been delivered in public and designed to shame rather than correct, but they could not change the reality of her competence, her character, or her determination to build a life that honored her dignity even when others failed to respect it. Winter descended on Manhattan with the kind of bone-chilling cold that made Clara's walk to work feel like a daily endurance test. Each morning, she pulled her thin coat tighter and hurried through the gray streets where her breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter air. The city felt harder in winter. The homeless huddled deeper in doorways. The tourists disappeared, and everyone moved with the grim efficiency of people trying to minimize their exposure to the elements. At Lydia's table, the atmosphere had grown increasingly tense since Tony's public reprimand of Clara 2 months earlier. He seemed to interpret her continued professional competence as a form of defiance, and he began finding fault with aspects of her service that had never drawn criticism before. The coffee was too hot or too cold, she was taking too long with table turnover, her uniform wasn't pressed properly. A steady stream of petty criticisms designed to wear down her confidence and reinforce his authority. Clara absorbed these daily humiliations with the same dignified silence she had perfected over years of service work. But the cumulative effect was beginning to erode her emotional reserves. She found herself dreading work in ways she never had before, and the job that had once provided stability and purpose now felt like a daily battle to maintain her self-respect in the face of systematic undermining. Thomas continued his morning routine, arriving at 7:15 and conducting his business calls, while Clara served his breakfast with scrupulous professional distance. But he had begun to notice the change in her demeanor. The way her shoulders remained slightly hunched even when she smiled, the careful control in her voice that suggested she was constantly braced for criticism, and the subtle but unmistakable signs of someone working under conditions of chronic stress. On a particularly bitter Thursday morning in January, when the temperature had dropped below freezing and the bistro's heating system was struggling to maintain comfortable conditions, Clara was carrying a tray of hot coffee when she slipped on a patch of melted snow that a customer had tracked in near the front door. The tray crashed to the floor, sending coffee and broken ceramic in all directions, and the sudden noise caused every conversation in the restaurant to stop as all eyes turned toward the source of the commotion. Clara immediately dropped to her knees to begin cleaning up the mess, her face burning with embarrassment as she tried to gather the broken pieces while apologizing profusely to the customers whose morning had been disrupted by her accident. Several people began offering to help, but she waved them away with the automatic response of someone who had been trained never to let customers witness the unglamorous aspects of restaurant work. Tony emerged from the kitchen within seconds, drawn by the sound of breaking dishes and the sudden silence that indicated something had gone wrong in his dining room. His face darkened as he surveyed the scene, coffee soaking into the carpet, ceramic shards scattered across the floor, and Clara kneeling in the middle of it all while a room full of customers watched her clean up her accident. "Jesus Christ, Clara!" Tony shouted, his voice carrying across the entire restaurant with the force of someone who had found the perfect excuse to release weeks of accumulated frustration. "How the hell do you drop a full tray of coffee? This isn't amateur hour. You've been doing this job for 6 years, and you're still making mistakes like a first-day trainee." The customers shifted uncomfortably as Tony's criticism escalated beyond what anyone would consider appropriate for a simple accident. Clara continued cleaning up the mess, her movements becoming more hurried as she tried to minimize the duration of the public spectacle that her misfortune had created. "Look at this mess," Tony continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "Do you have any idea what this carpet cleaning is going to cost me? And now I've got customers sitting in a restaurant that smells like spilled coffee and looks like a disaster zone. This is exactly the kind of careless amateur behavior that drives customers away." Thomas found himself standing up without conscious decision, his business instincts recognizing a situation that had escalated far beyond any reasonable response to an accidental spill. Every customer in the restaurant was now watching Tony berate Clara with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing someone else's complete humiliation, and the entertainment value of her degradation was making everyone complicit in her suffering. "That's enough," Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "It was an accident. Anyone can slip on a wet floor." Tony turned toward Thomas with surprise and growing anger, clearly unaccustomed to having customers intervene in his management of staff problems. "This doesn't concern you, sir. This is between me and my employee." "Actually, it does concern me," Thomas replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm a customer in your restaurant, and I'm watching you verbally abuse a member of your staff for an accident that could happen to anyone. It's unprofessional, it's cruel, and it's making everyone in here uncomfortable." The confrontation had now shifted from Clara's accident to a direct challenge to Tony's authority, with every customer in the restaurant serving as an audience for a power struggle that had implications far beyond the broken coffee cups. Clara looked up from her cleaning with a mixture of gratitude and terror, recognizing that Thomas's intervention was both protective and potentially catastrophic for her job security. "Sir, I appreciate your concern," Tony said, his voice tight with the effort to maintain customer service politeness while asserting his managerial authority. "But I need to address performance issues with my staff when they occur. Clara has been having problems with her work lately, and this kind of carelessness is exactly what I've been talking to her about." "I've been coming here for months," Thomas replied, "and I've never seen Clara provide anything less than excellent service. She's professional, efficient, and courteous. What I'm seeing right now isn't management, it's bullying." The word bullying hung in the air like an accusation that transformed the entire scene from a routine workplace discipline issue into something darker and more problematic. Several customers nodded in agreement with Thomas's assessment, while others looked away uncomfortably, recognizing the truth of his observation, but reluctant to involve themselves in someone else's workplace drama. Tony's face reddened with anger and embarrassment, his authority publicly challenged by a customer who possessed the economic power to damage the restaurant's reputation. "I think you should mind your own business, sir. This is my restaurant, and I'll manage my staff however I see fit." "And this is my money," Thomas replied, pulling out his wallet and placing a $20 bill on his table, "which I'll be spending somewhere else from now on, along with my colleagues, clients, and anyone else who asks me about restaurants in this neighborhood." The threat was delivered quietly, but its implications were clear to everyone in the room. Thomas Grayson was obviously wealthy, probably influential, and definitely serious about taking his business elsewhere. In a neighborhood where word-of-mouth recommendations could make or break small businesses, his disapproval represented a legitimate threat to Lydia's table's economic viability. Clara had finished cleaning up most of the spilled coffee and broken ceramic, but she remained kneeling on the floor, frozen by the realization that her accident had somehow escalated into a confrontation that might cost her the job she desperately needed. Tony's public criticism had been humiliating but survivable. Thomas's intervention was protective but potentially devastating if it resulted in her being fired for causing problems with valuable customers. "Clara," Thomas said gently, addressing her directly for the first time since the incident began, Are you hurt? Did you cut yourself on any of the broken pieces? The question was asked with genuine concern for her physical well-being, a consideration that had not occurred to Tony during his extended criticism of her professional competence. Clara shook her head, touched by his thoughtfulness even as she worried about the consequences of accepting his sympathy in front of her employer. "I'm fine," she said quietly, rising to her feet and brushing off her uniform while avoiding eye contact with either Thomas or Tony. "I'm very sorry about the accident, and I'll pay for the carpet cleaning out of my tips." "You absolutely will not," Tony snapped, apparently interpreting her offer as an admission of culpability that he could use to justify further punishment. "The carpet cleaning will come out of your paycheck, along with the cost of replacing the dishes. And if I have any more problems with your performance, you'll be looking for work somewhere else." Thomas felt his anger surge at Tony's vindictive response to what had clearly been an accident, but he recognized that further intervention might only make Clara's situation worse. Instead, he gathered his coat and briefcase, nodded politely to the other customers who had witnessed the entire scene, and walked toward the exit. As he reached the door, he turned back toward Clara one final time. "I hope your day gets better," he said, using the same words she had offered him months earlier when he was struggling with his own problems. Then he left, taking with him the promise to redirect his business and his recommendations to restaurants that treated their staff with basic human decency. The silence that followed Thomas's departure was heavy with awkwardness and unresolved tension. Clara finished wiping down the area where she had spilled the coffee, hyper-aware that every customer was still watching her movements while trying to process what they had just witnessed. Some seemed sympathetic to her situation, while others appeared relieved that the confrontation was over and they could return to their breakfast routines. Tony retreated to the kitchen without further comment, leaving Clara to continue her shift under the weight of knowing that her employment was now more precarious than ever. Thomas's intervention had been well-intentioned and morally correct, but it had also marked her as someone who attracted problematic attention from customers and disrupted the smooth operation of the restaurant. The rest of Clara's shift passed in a haze of hyper-vigilant service, as she tried to anticipate and prevent any situation that might provide Tony with additional ammunition for criticism. Every interaction with customers felt loaded with potential consequences, every movement carefully calculated to avoid any appearance of carelessness or inattention. By the time her shift ended, she was emotionally exhausted from the constant stress of trying to be perfect while knowing that perfection might not be enough to save her job. As Clara walked home through the cold January streets, she replayed the morning's events with the obsessive attention that trauma tends to generate. Thomas's intervention had been brave and kind, but it had also highlighted her complete powerlessness in situations where other people made decisions about her professional fate without consulting her preferences or considering her needs. The accident itself had been minor, a few dollars worth of coffee and dishes, easily cleaned up and quickly forgotten under normal circumstances. But Tony's reaction had transformed it into a public humiliation that served to reinforce existing power dynamics while providing entertainment for customers who would never face similar treatment in their own workplaces. Thomas's defense of her had been gratifying and morally satisfying, but it had also emphasized the fundamental inequality of their positions. He could afford to challenge Tony's authority because his economic power made him invulnerable to retaliation. She could not afford similar self-advocacy because her economic vulnerability made any form of resistance potentially catastrophic. The complexity of the situation left Clara feeling grateful for Thomas's support, but also resentful of the circumstances that made his protection necessary and her own voice irrelevant. She was an adult woman with 6 years of excellent work experience, yet she had been reduced to the status of a child whose disputes required adult intervention because she lacked the power to defend herself effectively. That evening, as Clara sat in her small apartment reviewing job listings on her laptop, she received a text message from an unknown number. "This is Thomas Grayson. I got your number from directory assistance. I wanted to apologize for any trouble my intervention might have caused you today. If you need a reference for other employment opportunities, I would be happy to provide one. You deserve to work somewhere that appreciates your professionalism and treats you with dignity. The message was kind and well-intentioned, but it also served as confirmation that Thomas understood the likely consequences of the morning's confrontation better than he had revealed at the time. His offer of a reference was generous, but it was also an acknowledgement that Clara would probably need to find new employment because of his decision to challenge Tony's authority. Clara stared at the message for a long time before responding. Thank you for standing up for me today. I appreciate your offer of a reference. I hope you find a restaurant that deserves your business. Her reply was polite but distant, maintaining the boundaries that had been appropriate throughout their acquaintance while acknowledging his gesture of support. She did not mention that his intervention had probably cost her the job she needed, nor did she express the complicated mixture of gratitude and frustration that his protection had generated. 3 days later, Tony called Clara into his office before her shift began and informed her that her employment at Lydia's table was being terminated due to performance issues and customer complaints. The explanation was vague and clearly pretextual, since Clara had never received a single customer complaint in 6 years of work. But Tony's authority to fire employees did not require him to provide honest or reasonable justification for his decisions. Your final paycheck will include payment through today, minus the cost of the dishes and carpet cleaning from Thursday's incident, Tony said, his tone suggesting that he considered the matter closed and non-negotiable. You can pick it up at the end of the week. Clara accepted her termination with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout her employment, gathering her personal belongings from her locker and hanging up her apron for the final time. Several of her co-workers expressed sympathy and outrage at the unfairness of her firing, but none were in a position to offer practical assistance that would restore her income or job security. As Clara walked out of Lydia's table for the last time, carrying her belongings in a plastic bag and trying to process the reality of her sudden unemployment, she realized that Thomas's intervention had achieved exactly what Tony had intended all along: her removal from a job where she had been competent, professional, and increasingly inconvenient for a supervisor who preferred compliance to excellence. The irony was both bitter and instructive. Thomas's effort to protect her dignity had ultimately cost her the economic security that made dignity possible, while Tony's campaign of systematic humiliation had finally succeeded in eliminating an employee whose competence had somehow become threatening to his authority. The outcome satisfied no one except Tony, who had successfully demonstrated that challenging his management style carried professional consequences regardless of the moral or practical merits of the challenge. Spring arrived in New York with the tentative warmth of a season that knew better than to make promises about permanence. Clara had been unemployed for 3 months, surviving on the combination of unemployment benefits, her rapidly dwindling savings, and the occasional catering job that barely covered her basic expenses. The job market for experienced waitresses was surprisingly competitive, complicated by employers who were wary of hiring someone whose previous boss would not provide a positive reference. Tony had made it clear through his network of restaurant industry contacts that Clara was difficult and attracted problematic customer attention, descriptions that were impossible to refute without telling the full story of his systematic harassment and her eventual termination for defending herself. The service industry operated on informal networks of reputation and recommendation, and Tony's poisonous assessment of her character had made finding comparable employment nearly impossible. Clara had applied for dozens of positions: restaurants, hotels, catering companies, and even retail stores that might value her customer service experience. Most applications disappeared into automated systems that provided no human feedback, while the few interviews she obtained ended with polite rejections and vague promises to keep her resume on file for future opportunities that never materialized. Her savings account had dwindled from 3 months of expenses to 6 weeks to 2 weeks, and now she was facing the terrifying mathematics of poverty that reduced every decision to questions of immediate survival versus slightly delayed catastrophe. Her rent was due in 10 days, her student loan payment was already overdue, and her refrigerator contained the kind of sparse inventory that turned meal planning into an exercise in creative desperation. The text message from Thomas had remained unanswered in her phone, his offer of a reference both generous and useless, since most employers preferred references from immediate supervisors rather than customers who had observed her work from a distance. Clara had drafted responses numerous times before deleting them, unsure whether acknowledging his role in her unemployment would sound accusatory or simply pathetic. On a warm Tuesday morning in April, Clara was walking through Washington Square Park after another fruitless interview at a coffee shop that had seemed interested until she mentioned her gap in employment. The park was filled with the usual mixture of dog walkers, students, and office workers stealing a few minutes of outdoor time before returning to their climate-controlled buildings. Cherry blossoms were blooming along the pathways, their delicate pink petals a reminder that beauty persisted even when everything else felt precarious. She was sitting on a bench near the fountain, reviewing her budget on her phone and calculating how many more weeks she could survive on ramen noodles and library books when she heard a familiar voice calling her name. Thomas Grayson was walking toward her, dressed in his usual business attire but looking somehow less polished than she remembered. His hair slightly mussed by the spring breeze, his tie loosened in concession to the warming weather. "Clara," he said again, his voice carrying obvious relief at having found her. "I've been looking for you for weeks. You stopped working at Lydia's table, and no one would tell me where you'd gone." Clara stood up instinctively, the automatic politeness of service work still governing her responses, even though she was no longer professionally obligated to accommodate his needs. "Hello, Mr. Grayson," she said quietly. "Yes, I'm no longer employed at the restaurant." Thomas studied her face, noting the subtle signs of stress that accompanied sustained financial pressure, the careful maintenance of her appearance despite obviously worn clothing, the controlled politeness that masked deeper exhaustion, and the way she held herself with dignity even while sitting alone in a public park on a Tuesday morning when most people were at work. "Because of what happened that morning," Thomas said. It was not a question, but a statement of understanding, an acknowledgement of the consequences that had followed his intervention. "Tony fired you because I challenged his treatment of you." Clara had imagined this conversation dozens of times during her months of unemployment, alternately rehearsing gracious acceptance of his protection and angry accusations about the costs of his interference. But now that he stood before her, she found herself responding with simple honesty rather than practiced politeness or justified anger. "He fired me because he could," Clara replied. "Your intervention gave him a convenient excuse, but he was looking for reasons to get rid of me long before that morning. I think my competence made him uncomfortable, and you defending me just confirmed that I attracted the kind of attention he preferred to avoid." Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settle in his chest as he processed the full implications of Clara's unemployment. His effort to protect her dignity had eliminated her livelihood, while Tony's campaign of harassment had achieved its intended goal through the indirect mechanism of customer intervention rather than direct termination for cause. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, the words carrying a gravity that acknowledged both his good intentions and their disastrous consequences. "I should have realized that defending you publicly might make your situation worse rather than better. I was thinking about the principle rather than the practical implications." Clara looked at him with a mixture of appreciation and sadness, recognizing the sincerity of his regret, while understanding that apologies could not restore her income or repair the professional reputation that Tony had systematically destroyed. "I know you were trying to help," she said gently, "and I'm grateful that someone finally said something about the way he treated his staff. It's just, principles are luxuries that people like me can't always afford." The observation hung in the air between them, highlighting the fundamental difference in their economic positions that made moral gestures differently costly depending on who performed them. Thomas could afford to challenge Tony's authority because his wealth insulated him from retaliation. Clara could not afford similar self-advocacy because her economic vulnerability made any form of resistance potentially catastrophic. "Have you been able to find other work?" Thomas asked, though Clara's presence in the park on a Tuesday morning suggested that her job search had not been successful. The question was asked with genuine concern rather than polite curiosity, as if her employment status mattered to him for reasons beyond casual courtesy. "It's been challenging," Clara admitted, using the euphemistic language that disguised desperation as temporary inconvenience. "The restaurant industry is fairly tight-knit, and word gets around about employees who cause problems with management. Tony's made it clear that he doesn't consider me a good employment risk." Thomas understood immediately the implications of Clara's carefully worded explanation. Tony's network of industry contacts had effectively blacklisted her from similar employment, while her gap in work history would raise questions with employers outside the service industry who might wonder why an experienced waitress was seeking to change careers rather than finding comparable restaurant work. "That's unacceptable," Thomas said, his voice carrying the anger of someone discovering the full scope of an injustice he had inadvertently facilitated. "He can't destroy your professional reputation because he disagreed with your customer service approach." "Actually, he can," Clara replied with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had spent 3 months learning about the limited legal protections available to service workers. "At-will employment means he can fire me for any reason that isn't specifically protected by law, and he can share his assessment of my work performance with other employers who ask for references. There's nothing illegal about what he's doing." The conversation was taking place in the middle of a beautiful spring day, surrounded by blooming flowers and the sounds of children playing, but it felt heavy with the weight of systemic inequalities that made personal cruelty both legal and profitable for people in positions of authority. Thomas was beginning to understand that his wealth had shielded him from economic realities that governed most people's lives, creating blind spots that made well-intentioned interventions potentially harmful rather than helpful. "What can I do to help?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who recognized that good intentions required practical follow-through to avoid becoming meaningless gestures. "My reference offer still stands, and I have connections in businesses that might value your experience even without restaurant industry recommendations." Clara considered his offer, weighing her pride against her increasingly desperate financial situation. Accepting help from Thomas felt like acknowledging defeat, confirmation that she could not solve her problems through her own efforts and competence. But rejecting assistance out of pride would be a luxury she could not afford if it meant losing her apartment or defaulting on her student loans. "I appreciate the offer," Clara said finally. "I've been trying to handle this on my own, but 3 months without income has pretty much exhausted my options. If you know of any opportunities that might be appropriate for someone with my background, I would be grateful for an introduction." Thomas felt a surge of relief that Clara was willing to accept his assistance, combined with anger at the circumstances that had made such help necessary. "I've been thinking about this situation for months," he said. "Not just your specific case, but the broader issues it represents. The way service workers are treated, the power dynamics that make abuse possible, and the economic vulnerabilities that prevent people from defending themselves effectively." He paused, clearly organizing thoughts that had been developing during the months since Clara's termination. "I want to offer you something more substantial than just a reference or a job introduction. I want to offer you an opportunity to help me address some of these systemic problems while building a career that uses your skills and intelligence in ways that restaurant work never could." Clara listened with careful attention, recognizing that Thomas was leading toward some kind of substantial proposal, but unsure what form his assistance might take or what obligations it might create. Her experience with wealthy people had taught her that generosity often came with expectations that were not immediately apparent, and she was wary of accepting help that might compromise her independence or create obligations she could not fulfill. "What kind of opportunity?" Clara asked, her voice carefully neutral, as she tried to assess both the potential benefits and risks of whatever Thomas was preparing to suggest. Thomas took a deep breath, clearly aware that his next words would fundamentally alter the trajectory of their relationship, while potentially providing Clara with the economic security and professional dignity that her termination had eliminated. "I want to hire you to help me develop and manage a foundation focused on improving working conditions and economic opportunities for service industry employees. It would be a full-time position with salary, benefits, and the chance to make a real difference in addressing the kinds of problems you've experienced firsthand." The offer was so unexpected and generous that Clara found herself momentarily speechless, struggling to process the possibility that her months of unemployment might end with a position that addressed her personal situation while contributing to solutions for broader social problems. It seemed almost too good to be true, which made her wonder about the hidden complications or expectations that might accompany such apparent generosity. "That's incredibly generous," Clara said slowly. "But I have to ask, why me? You barely know me beyond our morning coffee routine and one dinner conversation. There must be people with more relevant experience or better qualifications who could manage a foundation." Thomas smiled, the expression carrying genuine warmth rather than the calculated charm of business negotiations. "Actually, there isn't anyone with more relevant experience. You've lived the problems we would be trying to solve. You understand the daily realities of service work, the power dynamics that enable abuse, and the economic pressures that make resistance difficult or impossible. That kind of knowledge can't be learned from textbooks or business school case studies," he continued, his enthusiasm growing as he outlined his vision for the foundation. "Besides, you've already demonstrated the skills we would need. You're intelligent, articulate, professional under pressure, and capable of finding practical solutions to complex problems. Remember, you're the person who fixed a stuck elevator when trained technicians couldn't figure out the problem. You have exactly the combination of real-world experience and problem-solving ability that this kind of work requires." Clara felt tears welling in her eyes as she realized that Thomas's offer represented not just financial security, but genuine recognition of her competence and potential in ways that restaurant work had never provided. For 6 years, she had been valued primarily for her ability to remain invisible while anticipating other people's needs. Thomas was offering her an opportunity to be visible, valued, and influential in addressing problems that affected millions of workers like herself. "I would need to learn about foundation management, grant writing, program development," Clara said, her practical instincts automatically identifying the skills she would need to develop for success in this new role. "I have business classes and work experience, but nothing specifically related to nonprofit management or social advocacy." "We'll figure it out together," Thomas replied. "I have the financial resources and business connections. You have the personal experience and practical knowledge. Between us, we can learn what we need to know and hire additional expertise where necessary. The most important qualification is commitment to making a meaningful difference, and I think you've already demonstrated that." As they talked through the details of Thomas's proposal, salary, benefits, office space, initial project ideas, Clara found herself cautiously optimistic about the possibility of rebuilding her career in a field that honored both her intelligence and her experience, rather than requiring her to hide either one in service to other people's comfort. The conversation lasted for 2 hours, continuing through lunch at a nearby cafe where Clara noticed that Thomas treated the waitstaff with the kind of respectful attention that had been absent from his behavior during their early morning encounters at Lydia's table. His intervene on her behalf had apparently taught him lessons about the humanity of service workers that extended beyond their specific situation. By the time they parted that afternoon, Clara had accepted Thomas's offer, pending the practical details of setting up the foundation and defining her responsibilities. As she walked home through the spring sunshine, carrying Thomas's business card and the promise of employment that would begin in 2 weeks, she felt a cautious optimism that had been absent from her life since Tony's campaign of harassment began. The irony was not lost on her that the same man whose morning coffee she had served for months, whose intervention had cost her job, was now offering her an opportunity to address the systemic problems that had made such intervention necessary in the first place. Their relationship had evolved from customer and server to something approaching partnership, united by shared recognition that individual acts of kindness, while valuable, were insufficient to address the broader inequalities that made such kindness necessary. That evening, Clara called her unemployment office to report that she had found employment, drafted her resignation from the job search that had consumed 3 months of increasingly desperate effort, and began researching foundation management and nonprofit advocacy with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found work that engaged both her intellect and her values. For the first time since leaving Lydia's table, Clara went to bed feeling hopeful about her future, rather than anxious about her ability to survive the present. Thomas's offer had provided not just financial security, but the possibility of transforming her personal experience of workplace abuse into meaningful advocacy for others who lacked the resources or connections to defend themselves effectively. The foundation they would build together might not solve all the problems faced by service workers, but it would represent a practical commitment to addressing the power imbalances and economic vulnerabilities that made dignity a luxury rather than a basic human right for millions of working Americans. 5 years later, on a sunny morning in October, Clara Martinez stood behind a podium in the ballroom of the Marriott Marquis, looking out at an audience of 300 restaurant managers, hotel executives, service workers, and labor advocates who had gathered for the annual conference of the Dignity and Service Foundation. Her navy blue suit was perfectly tailored, her dark hair pulled back in a professional chignon, and her voice carried the confident authority of someone who had spent years developing expertise in workplace advocacy and organizational change. The woman who had once apologized for existing while serving coffee to impatient customers had been transformed into someone who commanded attention and respect from industry leaders who previously would not have bothered to learn her name. But the transformation went deeper than professional success. Clara carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered that her intelligence and experience were valuable assets rather than inconvenient complications. When I started working in restaurants 15 years ago, Clara told her audience, I thought my job was to be invisible, to anticipate needs without being asked, to solve problems without drawing attention, and to absorb frustration without defending myself. I was very good at being invisible, so good that I almost disappeared entirely, even to myself. The audience listened with the careful attention of people who recognized both the personal story and the broader social patterns it represented. Many of the service workers present had their own experiences with the systematic devaluation of their labor and humanity, while the executives and managers were beginning to understand the costs of treating employees as replaceable components rather than valuable human resources. The Foundation's research over the past 5 years has documented what most of you already know from experience, Clara continued, gesturing toward the presentation screen that displayed statistics about employee turnover, workplace harassment, and the economic costs of treating service workers as expendable. Restaurants and hotels that invest in employee dignity, through fair wages, respectful management practices, and genuine opportunities for advancement, see measurable improvements in customer satisfaction, employee retention, and long-term profitability. Thomas sat at a table near the front of the room, watching Clara command the stage with the pride of someone who had witnessed her evolution from invisible waitress to influential advocate. Their foundation had grown from his initial investment of $2 million to an organization with an annual budget of $12 million, supporting research, training programs, and direct assistance to service workers facing workplace abuse or economic hardship. The work had been more challenging and more rewarding than either of them had anticipated. Clara had enrolled in graduate school to study nonprofit management and labor relations, earning her MBA while simultaneously building the foundation's programs and establishing its credibility within both the service industry and the broader advocacy community. Thomas had discovered that using his wealth to address systemic problems was more satisfying than accumulating additional zeros in his investment portfolios, and their partnership had taught him lessons about leadership that his previous business experience had not provided. Our pilot program in New York has worked with 47 restaurants and 12 hotels to implement dignity-based management practices, Clara reported, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone delivering evidence of meaningful progress. Participating businesses have seen average employee turnover decrease by 38%, customer satisfaction scores improve by 15%, and net profitability increase by an average of 12% over 2 years. The numbers represented more than statistical improvements. They represented thousands of individual service workers who now went to work without fearing arbitrary criticism, public humiliation, or termination for defending their basic dignity. Each percentage point of reduced turnover meant dozens of people who could maintain stable employment while developing their skills and advancing their careers. During the lunch break, Clara was approached by a young woman who looked familiar, despite the professional setting and business attire that distinguished conference attendees from typical restaurant customers. It took Clara a moment to recognize Maria Santos, who had been a server at a diner in Queens when they first met 3 years earlier during one of the foundation's outreach efforts. "Ms. Martinez," Maria said, her voice carrying obvious pride in addressing Clara by the professional title that acknowledged her expertise and authority. "I wanted to thank you again for the scholarship program. I graduate from culinary school next month, and I already have a job lined up as a sous chef at a restaurant that participates in your Dignity Standards program." Clara felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came from witnessing individual success stories that demonstrated the practical impact of their advocacy work. "I remember your application essay," Clara replied warmly. "You wrote about wanting to create work environments where creativity and respect went hand in hand. How do you feel about starting your career in management rather than continuing as front-of-house staff?" "Honestly, terrifying and exciting in equal measure," Maria laughed. "But knowing that there are standards and support systems in place makes it feel possible in ways it never did before. I've worked for managers who treated staff like furniture, and I've seen what that does to everyone involved. I want to be the kind of supervisor I wish I'd had when I was starting out." Their conversation was interrupted by the conference organizer, who informed Clara that the afternoon panel on transforming workplace culture through leadership development was about to begin. As Clara made her way toward the stage, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from serving coffee in obscurity to addressing industry leaders about systemic change in service work. The afternoon panel included Thomas as a representative of foundation funders, Dr. Patricia Williams from the Cornell School of Hotel Administration, and James Rivera, who managed restaurants for a chain that had been among the foundation's earliest adopters of dignity-based practices. Clara served as the moderator, guiding discussion about the practical challenges of implementing cultural change in businesses that had traditionally operated on hierarchical power structures and cost minimization strategies. "The biggest obstacle we encountered," James Rivera explained to the audience, "was convincing middle management that respectful treatment of staff would actually improve rather than undermine their authority. A lot of supervisors had learned that fear and humiliation were effective management tools, and they were genuinely concerned that treating employees with dignity would make them seem weak or ineffective." Dr. Williams nodded in agreement. "Our research indicates that managers who feel insecure about their own positions are most likely to use degrading treatment as a way to reinforce hierarchy. When you give those same managers better training, clearer performance standards, and support for professional development, they become much more effective leaders without needing to diminish the people they supervise. Thomas added his perspective as someone who had transitioned from traditional business practices to advocacy-focused leadership. I think we also have to acknowledge the role that customers play in perpetuating disrespectful treatment of service workers. When diners or hotel guests expect staff to absorb abuse without response, they're essentially demanding that businesses choose between customer satisfaction and employee dignity. We've had to work with participating businesses to develop protocols for handling customers who treat staff inappropriately. Clara listened to these observations with the satisfaction of someone who had helped develop solutions to problems she had experienced firsthand. The Foundation's training programs now included specific modules on managing customer expectations, de-escalating conflicts before they became abusive, and supporting staff when they encountered unreasonable treatment from patrons who believed that service workers existed solely for their convenience. One of our most successful interventions, Clara told the audience, has been helping businesses articulate clear standards for customer behavior and empowering managers to refuse service to people who treat staff disrespectfully. It sounds simple, but many businesses had never explicitly stated that customers don't have the right to verbally abuse employees, and staff had never been given permission to seek management support when faced with abusive treatment. The panel discussion continued for 90 minutes, covering topics that ranged from wage structures and benefits packages to communication training and conflict resolution protocols. Throughout the session, Clara found herself alternating between her roles as expert advocate and former service worker, drawing on both her professional knowledge and her personal experience to address complex questions about implementation strategies and cultural change. As the conference wound down and attendees began making their way toward the hotel exits, Clara felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction that followed successful public speaking events. She had spent years developing the confidence and expertise that allowed her to command respect from industry leaders, but part of her still remembered the woman who had once apologized for breathing too loudly while serving coffee to impatient customers. Thomas approached as Clara was gathering her materials and preparing to leave the hotel. "Excellent work today," he said, his voice carrying genuine admiration for Clara's professional development and leadership abilities. "I think we made some real progress with the restaurant chain executives who attended. 3 of them asked for follow-up meetings to discuss implementing our standards in their businesses." "It's still amazing to me that people actually listen when I talk," Clara admitted, laughing at her own surprise despite 5 years of successful advocacy work. "Sometimes I feel like I'm playing dress-up in someone else's professional life." "That feeling never entirely goes away," Thomas replied. "But the difference is that now you're the person other people aspire to become. Maria Santos doesn't see someone playing dress-up. She sees someone who transformed personal experience into expertise and used that knowledge to create opportunities for others facing similar challenges." As they walked through the hotel lobby toward the street, Clara noticed a young woman in a server's uniform refilling water glasses at the hotel's restaurant. The woman moved with the careful efficiency that Clara remembered from her own service days, anticipating needs while remaining as invisible as possible to customers who were focused on their conversations and business dealings. On impulse, Clara approached the server and waited for a pause in her duties. "Excuse me," Clara said gently. "I just wanted to say that I noticed your excellent service during the conference breaks. You made everyone feel welcomed and comfortable, which is a real skill." The server looked up with surprise, clearly unused to receiving direct compliments from hotel guests. "Thank you," she replied, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested English was not her first language. "I try to do good work." "I can tell," Clara said, recognizing something of her younger self in the woman's careful politeness and professional composure. "If you ever decide you want to explore other opportunities in hospitality or restaurant management, here's my card. We have scholarship programs and mentorship opportunities that might interest you." The server accepted Clara's business card with obvious curiosity, reading the foundation's name and mission statement printed beneath Clara's professional contact information. "You help people like me?" she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and skepticism that Clara remembered from her own early encounters with unexpected opportunities. "We help people who work hard, treat others with respect, and want to build careers that honor their intelligence and abilities," Clara replied. "If that describes you, then yes, we help people like you." As Clara and Thomas left the hotel and walked toward their respective cars in the parking garage, they reflected on the day's successes and the ongoing challenges that remained in their efforts to transform workplace culture throughout the service industry. 5 years of advocacy work had produced measurable improvements in specific businesses and individual lives, but systemic change remained an ongoing process that required sustained effort and constant vigilance. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't intervened that morning at Lydia's table?" Thomas asked as they reached Clara's car. It was a question he had posed periodically over the years, usually after events that highlighted how dramatically both their lives had changed since that pivotal confrontation with Tony. "I try not to think in terms of alternate histories," Clara replied, though she had certainly considered the same question during quiet moments when she reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought her from invisible service to visible leadership. "Maybe I would have eventually found another job and continued serving coffee while taking night classes. Maybe I would have saved enough money to open my own restaurant someday. Or maybe Tony's harassment would have worn me down until I gave up on my dreams entirely." She paused, considering the broader implications of their shared experience. "What I do know is that individual acts of kindness or cruelty can have consequences that extend far beyond their immediate impact. Your intervention cost me one job but led to opportunities I never could have imagined. Tony's abuse was designed to destroy my confidence, but it ultimately motivated me to understand and address the systemic problems that made such treatment possible." Thomas nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Clara's analysis, while still feeling occasional pangs of guilt about the unintended consequences of his well-intentioned defense. "I'm grateful for how everything worked out, but I'm also more careful now about intervening in situations where I don't fully understand the power dynamics involved. Good intentions aren't enough if they make things worse for the people we're trying to help." "That's probably the most important lesson either of us learned," Clara agreed. "Real change requires understanding systems rather than just addressing symptoms. Individual generosity or moral courage can make a difference in specific situations. But lasting improvement requires changing the structures that make abuse possible and profitable in the first place." As they prepared to part ways, Thomas heading to his office to review Foundation financial reports, Clara returning to her apartment to prepare for a television interview about workplace dignity. Both reflected on how their unlikely partnership had evolved into something neither could have predicted when they first encountered each other across the invisible divide that separated customer from server. The foundation they had built together now employed 43 people, supported programs in 12 states, and had influenced policy discussions at the federal level about minimum wage standards, workplace harassment protections, and employee rights in the service industry. More importantly, it had created pathways for thousands of service workers to develop their skills, advance their careers, and work in environments that honored their humanity as well as their labor. Clara's personal transformation from invisible waitress to influential advocate had paralleled the foundation's growth from Thomas's individual guilty conscience to a respected voice in national conversations about economic justice and workplace dignity. But the most significant change had been in their understanding of how individual relationships could serve as catalysts for broader social progress when they were grounded in mutual respect rather than charity or noblesse oblige. As Clara drove home through the familiar streets of Manhattan, she passed the building where she and Thomas had first encountered each other as equals rather than customer and server, the evening when her mechanical knowledge had rescued him from a stuck elevator, and their conversation had revealed the possibility for genuine human connection across economic and social divides. The building looked the same from the outside, but Clara knew that the penthouse apartments and luxury amenities concealed the same kinds of invisible labor that kept all of Manhattan's elite spaces functioning smoothly. Somewhere in that building, staff members were cleaning bathrooms, delivering packages, maintaining elevators, and providing the countless services that allowed wealthy residents to live in comfort while remaining largely unaware of the human effort required to sustain their elevated lifestyles. The difference, Clara reflected, was that some of those workers now had access to resources and support systems that hadn't existed 5 years earlier. The Foundation's programs provided both practical assistance and broader advocacy that made invisible labor slightly more visible, precarious employment marginally more secure, and workplace dignity a realistic goal rather than an impossible dream. It wasn't enough. Systemic problems required systemic solutions that would take decades rather than years to fully implement. But it was meaningful progress that had already improved thousands of individual lives while demonstrating the possibility of more comprehensive change in the future. As Clara settled into her evening routine in the comfortable apartment that represented her economic security as well as her professional success, she thought about the server she had encountered at the hotel that afternoon and wondered whether the woman would follow up on the connection Clara had offered. Some people were ready to take risks for uncertain opportunities, while others needed to remain in familiar situations that provided predictable, if limited, rewards. Clara had been fortunate in her willingness to accept Thomas's unexpected offer of partnership, but she also recognized that fortune favored people who had developed enough confidence and competence to recognize genuine opportunities when they appeared. Her years of service work, night school classes, and careful observation of business operations had prepared her for success in ways that weren't immediately apparent until circumstances created the possibility for advancement. The Foundation's scholarship and mentorship programs were designed to help other service workers develop similar preparation for advancement opportunities, but individual success still required personal courage and commitment that no external support could provide. Clara could offer resources, training, and connections, but each person had to decide whether to remain in familiar limitations or risk pursuing unfamiliar possibilities. As she prepared for bed, Clara reflected on the strange symmetry of her current life compared to her years at Lydia's table. She still spent her days serving others, but now her service involved elevating rather than accommodating, challenging rather than accepting, and creating rather than merely maintaining. The fundamental impulse to help others remained constant, but her capacity to provide meaningful assistance had expanded beyond anything she could have imagined when she first moved to New York, with nothing but hope and determination. The next morning's television interview would give Clara another opportunity to share the Foundation's message with a broader audience, potentially reaching service workers who had never heard of their programs and business leaders who had never considered the connection between employee dignity and long-term profitability. Each public appearance represented both an individual achievement and a collective advancement for the millions of workers whose daily labor remained largely invisible to the people who benefited from their service. Clara fell asleep feeling grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought her from obscurity to visibility, from powerlessness to influence, and from serving others' immediate needs to addressing the deeper structural problems that made such service unnecessarily demeaning rather than naturally dignified. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to extend that journey toward systemic change that honored the humanity of everyone whose work made modern life possible. And you, have you ever been the invisible soul, the unnoticed spark in someone's life, working with dignity while others looked through you as if you were part of the scenery? Have you stood behind a counter, wiped down tables, or carried trays while customers conducted their lives around you, as if your thoughts, dreams, and struggles didn't matter? Or perhaps you've been the person in a position of power who finally opened your eyes to see the complete human being behind the service role, realizing that competence and grace come in forms you never bothered to notice. Clara's transformation from invisible waitress to respected advocate reminds us that dignity doesn't depend on job titles or bank accounts. It lives in the quiet strength of people who maintain their humanity despite working in systems designed to diminish it. Thomas's journey from oblivious customer to committed ally shows us that recognizing our blind spots can lead to partnerships that create change far beyond what either person could achieve alone. The foundation they built together proves that individual acts of recognition and respect can grow into institutional changes that honor the worth of every person whose labor makes our daily lives possible. When we truly see the people who serve us, not as functions or conveniences, but as complete human beings with their own intelligence, dreams, and dignity, we open possibilities for connection and collaboration that can transform both individual lives and broader social systems. Their story is ultimately about the power of visibility, what happens when invisible people are finally seen, when their skills are recognized, when their humanity matters as much as their service. It's about the courage required to stand up for others across lines of power and privilege, and the wisdom needed to ensure that good intentions create positive rather than harmful consequences. If Clara and Thomas's journey stirred something deep inside you, please leave a like and subscribe so this story can reach others who need to hear it. The servers who smile through difficult shifts, the managers searching for better ways to lead, and anyone who believes that dignity should never be a luxury reserved for those who can afford it. For more heartfelt stories that honor the invisible heroes who keep our world running, click the link to explore our collection of tales about courage, recognition, and the transformative power of finally being seen. Thank you for walking this emotional path with us, for believing that every person's story matters, and for understanding that sometimes the most profound changes begin with simply acknowledging the humanity that was there all along. Until our next story, keep your heart open to the possibility that the person serving your coffee, cleaning your hotel room, or helping you in countless other ways might be exactly the ally you need for the changes you want to see in the world.